Morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may happen to be, welcome. Welcome to the fourth annual conference on faith and entrepreneurship. My name is Brett Smith, and on behalf of everyone for the Center of Life, the John W. Altman Institute of Entrepreneurship here at Miami University, we are absolutely delighted to host this year's event. We are thrilled to be joined by some 200 registrants, and this brings the overall reach of the conference that was just an idea 4 years ago to something more than 800 registrants across 25 different countries. And from this vantage point and many others that we'll talk about throughout the day, it appears that the subfield on faith and entrepreneurship is rapidly emerging. If this is your first time attending the L.I.F.E conference, welcome. We're excited to have you. Please use this time to learn, to share, to connect, use the chat function, ask questions. Like, this is your time, please use it. If you've been with us every year, welcome back. We're once again blessed by your participation, your time, and your continued commitment. And we do have several people who this is not their second or third, but they've been here all 4 years. So thank you for your continued support and interest in this area. Building on last year's goal, which is to integrate more of the faith side into entrepreneurship. Many who are here are wonderful entrepreneur scholars, and so we're 90% entrepreneurship and maybe just a little bit faith. And our interest is to continue to broaden and deepen our understanding there. So this year we focused on a keynote speaker who can provide amazing insights into this area of religion and how we can more deeply engage with this part of the integration to advance research in this area. Today, Dr. Nathan French will be our keynote speaker. Dr. French is an associate professor in comparative religion here at Miami University. He earned his BA at Center College, his MA in Islamic Studies at WashU in St. Louis, and his PhD in religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His monograph, And God Knows the Martyrs, was published by the Oxford University Press in 2020. He is an affiliate of the Center for Life and a great friend here at Miami. And as one of my colleagues loves to say, if you're in the room with Nathan, you are unlikely to be the smartest person in the room. So setting the bar as high as we can possibly do it, so all he can do is underperform, we are pleased to welcome our friend and colleague, Nathan French. So Nathan, it's off to you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, colleagues. It's wonderful to see all of you. For those of you who may be out there observing the end of Ramadan, Eid Mubarak. I hope it's been a blessed fast and it was accepted. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have to confess to feeling a measure of a mild bit of intimidation. There are some really impressive scholars here, and it's really great to be here to think along with you. Before I get too far into my remarks today, I'd like to take the time to thank Brett Smith, Amanda Lawson, Corey Driver, and all of my colleagues who've been involved with the planning of the L.I.F.E conference for their work, both in public and behind the scenes, to bring this conference together. I'd also like to acknowledge the very generous gifts of John W. Altman to Miami's Institute for Entrepreneurship and the Farmer School of Business. And given that I'm a scholar trained in the humanities and adjacent to the social sciences, I'm deeply grateful for John Altman's gifts to the Humanities Center here at Miami as well. And I'd like to acknowledge with deep gratitude the gifts of the Williamson Family Foundation, without which none of this day's innovative work would be possible. And I should note, too, I'm grateful to all of you for being here. I know we're across the globe. Our time zones are scattered. I've been up since early this morning making sure my slides were all in order, so I'm sure you've been busy as well. So I'm really glad we're all here. I hope we have coffee or tea or other water ready to hand if needed. My remarks today are entitled Religion Matters. Orientation in the Study of Religious Entrepreneurship. And I want to walk us through what I mean by those terms, but before I do so, I think it's important to begin a sort of preliminary a preliminary orientation, if you will. We are here today studying on the lands, the traditional homelands of the Miamia and Shawnee people, who, along with other indigenous groups, the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. In 1972, a relationship between Miami University and the Miami tribe of Oklahoma began and evolved into a reciprocal relationship or partnership, excuse me, including the creation of the Miamia Center at Miami University in 2001. The work of the Miamia Center serves the Miami tribe community and is dedicated to the revitalization of Miami language and culture and to restoring that knowledge to the Miamia people. Miami University and the Miami tribe are proud of this work and of the more than 140 Miamia students who've attended Miami since 1991 through the Miamia Heritage Program. And before I continue, I want to make sure, Corey, Brett, Amanda, my slides, we're seeing the slide. We're good? Okay, excellent. So to my work today. My goal today isn't necessarily to argue to you a single thesis. Instead, I have some central questions that I'd very much like us to consider. Religion, when we speak of religious matters, what do we create and what do we exclude when we engage in a study of religion or a study of religious entrepreneurship? And how might we orient the study of religious entrepreneurship through various disciplines, in various scholarly conversations, as we approach new literatures or new approaches to the study of religion? You know, the task that I've set for myself then is one of orientation, but I do have to say I find myself a little bit disoriented as I open. And what I mean by this is over the past few months, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of getting to read through a substantial number of articles and other um, projects of research in religious entrepreneurship as Brett has helped me navigate this field and try to find a conversation that I could add to or contribute to within it. And it's really exciting to see the emergence, the rapid emergence of a subfield such as this, a conversation that I think is long overdue in the academic study of religion, particularly in North America. If you do a search for entrepreneurship in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion or other major journals in the study of religion, the academic study of religion, you don't see many articles dealing with entrepreneurship. So there are possibilities far outside of just entrepreneurship literature. So that in and of itself is very exciting. But at the same time, I am a scholar trained in the study of religion at a university in North America, and I, along with fellow colleagues in Western Europe and in Australia and elsewhere, are seeing a great contraction occur to our field. In fact, our department here at Miami University is not going to be immune to this. Our department will be going away. Our But we're in a time of considerable transition for the academic study of religion institutionally. And I think intellectual endeavors like the ones you're embarking on today are going to be an essential way of preserving the academic study of religion in our institutions moving forward. So I have four sort of orientations for us planned today. My first is going to deal with the subject of religion matters, and you'll be able to follow me through these slides with the O1 designator for that part. The second, religion as orientation, is going to deal with thinking about how we might provoke our thinking about how we orient ourselves in religious entrepreneurship by bringing in some materials related to my field of Islamic studies and my subfield, the study of contemporary jihadist movements. Then in orientation 3, we'll look at religion as a cultural system and the anthropology, debates within the anthropology of religion between Clifford Geertz and Talal Asad. And finally, religion as lived is where we will make our sort of conclusion and have a few provocations to help us think about religion as a lived experience. It goes without saying that I think one of the reasons we can say religion matters in our contemporary moment is that religion quite honestly isn't going away, although many of the headlines we might see suggest otherwise. Foundations and surveys from the Pew Foundation and others suggest that nations of varying religiosities, nations of various religious majorities, will see those populations grow over time. And of course, we know there will be tremendous diversities of religiosity within those nations. But suffice to say, all of the surveying that we have will suggest that human religiosity will remain with us. But that doesn't mean that it won't change or transform. as Elizabeth Drescher suggests in her study of religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, of religious nuns, or those who identify as religiously or spiritually unaffiliated. Researchers, she argues, will need to enrich and expand their understanding of what it means to be religious or spiritual today. Which means some of the work that we're going to be doing as we think about the idea of religion mattering is going to be a question of definition and how some scholars over time have defined religion. And reviewing the emerging literature on faith and entrepreneurship and religion and entrepreneurship, I saw names. Some of those we'll see today, such as Emil Durkheim. Some of those we won't, such as, for example, William James, foundational to the psychology of religion as a field. My title, Religion Matters, I'm borrowing from Stephen Prothero, a North American scholar of religion who has done extensive work on both the question of religious literacy, what are the baseline bodies of knowledge that undergraduates or the general public need to know about various of the so-called world's religions, but also the question of, are religions one or not? How do we attend to the differences across various faith, spiritual, and religious communities? And I'm borrowing his title and part of his framing, in part because I think it sets us up very well for the inquiries I'd like to explore today. One of those is, what is the matter with religion? In other words, what is the problem? What is the issue of studying religion as a scholarly question? And my field in the study of religion in our department at the American Academy of Religion, it's almost an ongoing joke or an ongoing point of contention that we never fully agree with how to define a religion, that it's actually the exercise of attempting to define it that can become really illuminating for us in our various disciplines of study. So religion is a scholarly problem. What is the matter with religion? But also then, what is the matter of religion? A play on words that I'd like to make. What constitutes religion? How do we recognize it when we see it? What are the concepts? What are the materials? What are the practices, the statements identify as religious? So what is the matter with religion, and what is the matter of religion? My department, in its title, is called a Department of Comparative Religion. And so when exploring the what is the matter with religion question, for us, it traces to the question of comparison, one laid out very early on by the Orientalist and philologist of religion, Max Muller, who argues that if a scholar knows only one religion, then a scholar may, in fact, know none. In other words, for Mueller, we must engage in comparison because it is of essential importance for us to see the ways in which our framing of religion get challenged over time. But you might note from Mueller's definition here on this slide that we actually see he tends to relay to us an idea of religion that is tied to religion as a question of tradition and as a question of a particular mental faculty, a question of belief. And this concept, this framing of religion as belief, is one we see continue to unfold as we move from the 19th into the 20th century in the history of how the field unfolds. If we look, for example, to the definition provided by sociologist of religion Emil Durkheim, ends by saying a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices. Those beliefs and practices are constituted by, he argues, a very unique set of building blocks to human religiosity, namely the construction of the sacred and the profane. And we see him allude to this in the definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. And implied within that sacrality is the profane, the exact opposite of the sacred, that which must not ever touch, corrupt, pollute, or affect the sacred, but might threaten it. That is to say, he says of sacred things, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices, for example, rites, which unite all those who adhere to them into one single moral community called a church. So when thinking about the matter, the physical things we may see, encounter, the ideas, the concepts we may bring to bear on the study of religion, Durkheim offers us the idea of the sacred and the profane, but this idea of religion as a mental faculty of belief. Rites, he will argue in his elementary forms of religious life, rites will emerge out of belief. And this ties back to deeper anthropological investigations of the history of religions in the turn of the 19th century, which we won't quite have time to go into today. But note that he ties these beliefs and practices to community, to a social framework, to an institution, which he labels, but he uses as a broader sort of catch-all for mosques and synagogues, temples, and other formal forms of religious association, an institutionalized religiosity, if you will. As the 20th century unfolds, two scholars with whose work I'm quite familiar, having attended the University of California, Santa Barbara, Ninian Smart and Catherine Albanese, both discuss for us the question of religiosity. Both discuss for us the question of religiosity, developing, in a sense, upon Durkheim's basic categories. Once again, we see this idea of creeds or beliefs. We see the idea of a ritual dimension. We see how that may play out in narrative, or a code for ethical conduct, or a question of experience, or the expression of these codes and rituals and creeds, as Albanese points to us, through community. Smart adds the material dimension, the objects, the clothing, the foods, the art, other forms of material culture that might be exchanged among members of various religious communities. So we see a number of different types of matter here. And in reading through broadly faith and entrepreneurship and religious entrepreneurship literature, I note a number of scholars come from disciplines within management and business, but often with disciplinary interests in psychology and sociology. And so we often see parts of these types of matter appear. We see questions about institutions, standards for entrepreneurial ethics, or ethics guiding certain forms of entrepreneurial behavior. We might see relationship to legal institutions. The issue that we face, however, is a slightly different one. And I've seen in some recent religion and entrepreneurship literature, and I know that Brett and several of his colleagues have published in varying ways on this, the question of what happens when religious entrepreneurs face difficulties, challenges, or problems. Or conversely, what happens when they are successful? How do religious entrepreneurs make sense of their success or their challenges vis-a-vis the matter of their religiosity? Stephen Prothero, in his framing of religion matters, suggests that this may mean we might study religiosities more broadly through the lens of religion as problem solving. So he suggests, as he tours his students through this introductory textbook, Religion Matters, through the various quote unquote world religions, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, he includes indigenous traditions such as the Navajo here in North America. He says he asks these communities as a comparative framework, back to Müller's idea of knowing many. What is the problem? How does an individual or community attempt to solve that problem? What is the solution to the problem? How might an individual try to solve the problem once identified? What are the techniques required of an individual or community to solve that problem? What sorts of perhaps conversion or rituals, fasts, or other types of communal or individual observations, prayers, for example, might need to occur to address the solution? And then who does one follow as an exemplar? Who should one take as a model for, or a model of how to solve this problem? Which prophets, gods, goddesses, scientists, economists, perhaps it's just reason. Who are the authorities? What should one use to trust to try to solve the problem presented by this map of the world offered by a particular religion? So far, hopefully, we've thought of a few ways or located a few ways that we might be able to map the work of faith and entrepreneurship or religious entrepreneurship onto these broader scholarly definitions and debates over the study of religion. And that's where our first major provocation comes into play. And that comes from the historian of religions from the University of Chicago, Jonathan Z. Smith. One of my students once asked, was that Gandalf the Grey? I felt very old. But I have to say, Professor Smith was an incredibly generous scholar and had a larger than life personality in the classroom as a lecturer. And he, I think, very comfortably would have said, have we solved the problem of religion with these new frames and these new approaches? And his response would be a resounding no. And that's where I think this becomes incredibly challenging for us. And this is something I would like to encourage all of you to consider as you move through the conference today. Smith writes, while there's a staggering amount of data, of phenomena, of human experiences and expressions that might be characterized in one culture or another by one criterion or another as religion, there is no data for the study of religion. When it comes to the question of the matter of religion, we have no inbuilt data set. We have no thing we can point to and say, yes, that is religion, particularly when we engage in comparison across religiosities and across cultures. Instead, Smith provokes us to consider, what if religion, the concept, this definition we routinely debate and cite, is solely the creation of a scholar's study? This is a remarkable provocation. This is a call to a certain type of responsibility as scholars. As we work in our subfields, as we consider the question of religious entrepreneurship, we must move them through the adjective religious and think, how are we participating in the furthering of certain perceptions of religiosity? Types of religiosities might we be foreclosing upon? What might we be excluding as a result of pursuing our disciplines and our methods? Smith continues, it's created for the scholar's analytic purposes by his or her or their imaginative acts of comparison and generalization. Religion, he writes, has no independent existence apart from the academy. Now, this might cause some of you listening to pull back. Perhaps this real take a sip of coffee, given that we're in so many different time zones. But Smith really is provoking us here. He wants us to be, as he writes, relentlessly self-conscious about the work that we do, because our self-consciousness, our awareness of our responsibilities to the communities whom we are studying, or in the case of scholar practitioners, to the communities with which we may be part, is very important, because each time we write, we publish, we research, we speak about religion, we are defining, redefining, and foreclosing upon certain possibilities. It is inevitable. It is unavoidable. But my goal today, as we move into our next orientation, is to help you think of ways of taking something that may be familiar, religious entrepreneurship, faith in entrepreneurship, perhaps your own personal faith, spiritual practice, whatever it may be, or none, to take what seems familiar and to help you find ways of making it unfamiliar. That is, stepping outside of it, which is something Smith encourages us to do. He says the mark of good religious studies scholarship, whatever it may be, familiar seem unfamiliar, and what is unfamiliar come to seem familiar. And so that moves me then to this question of religion as orientation. And I've chosen here a map of the United States from 1803, produced by the Ottoman Empire, in part because on this map we see in the yellow area the US East Coast from New England all the way down to Florida, the map of the early United States. But the Ottoman map also includes for us, speaking of land acknowledgments and orientation, a number of the names of the First Nations and indigenous tribes who were still to the west and being gradually pushed away from their lands by the US government. A reminder that what the US is and what North America is will look differently depending on which territory and where we find ourselves on which part of this map. So what might it mean to orient ourselves in the study of religious entrepreneurship alongside other fields of study? Now, this, I will admit to you, might seem a little bit of a leap. My scholarship deals with the study of contemporary jihadist movements. My first monograph, And God Knows the Martyrs, deals with how Al-Qaeda fighters and ISIS fighters, collectively referred to in my field as jihadi Salafis, appropriate, reinterpret, and apply Islamic laws in order to justify, in their own worldview and framing, horrific acts of violence. Of course, the overwhelming majority of Muslims across the globe condemn these movements, but in my work, I have to attend to how they interpret and understand Islam and jihad and the question of violence. Often, this is a real challenge for scholars who study Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And there's an intervention that was made a few years ago by the anthropologist and international legal scholar Darrell Lee that noted that in terrorism studies and other disciplinary fields related to the study of jihadist violence, we often see scholarship that has a tendency to collect, collate, identify, and classify movements as if we were constructing a sort of demonology, Lee says. We sort of create a zoology of jihadist movements. And he wants to provoke his readers to think about them differently. He says, if we want to write intelligible scholarship about jihadism, then we need to engage and understand the political struggles at work by understanding the social forces that drive them. We need to understand the worldly goals that jihadists pursue, agonisms, the challenges that they face. Jihadi groups may invoke authorities above any extant legal system, any nation state within which they live, and they're hardly alone in doing so, he says. But such universalist messages end with and often work through actual institutions such as states. Now, what happens if we substitute the word jihad and reframe this? What if we write an intelligible account about contemporary entrepreneurs invoking religion? I think we could argue we should understand their political and economic struggles. We should understand the social forces that might be driving them and the worldly goals or otherworldly spiritual goals that they pursue and the challenges that they face. They may invoke authorities beyond their local laws, but they're doing so in response to local institutions. To be very clear, this does not mean that I am suggesting that jihadists and entrepreneurs are the same, although there is literature that does study jihadists as entrepreneurial in their thinking. But instead, I want us to be thinking about how we're locating religious entrepreneurship within the world to see if we can borrow some framing from completely unrelated fields also engaged in the study of religion. If we look at one operative definition of religious entrepreneurship as the discovery, enactment, evaluation, and exploitation of opportunities to create future goods and services motivated by the cultural and ideological beliefs, practices, and/or outcomes rooted in religious faith, then we might see a few parallels between those definitions as we just laid them out. So, in thinking about this, then, and thinking about this question, what happens when we try to apply this reframing of entrepreneurs within the world to questions asked by prior researchers? What happens if we go back to the future, in a sense, when we look at the study of religious entrepreneurship in the world? And I see that Brett's put a link to this in the chat, which is terrific. At the conclusion to this article that was published in 2013 in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, the authors Doherty, Newbert, and Greibel and Park offer us several concluding questions as avenues for future directions. And I was struck by their language here across these. Why do entrepreneurs exhibit certain religious beliefs and behaviors? I could easily substitute that word with jihadists. Why do jihadists exhibit certain beliefs and behaviors? Do individuals pick a congregation that matches their entrepreneurial orientation, or can a congregation prime entrepreneurial orientation? And then, how is religion related to entrepreneurial behavior? And more importantly, why? This question of orientation, this language of orientation, reminded me specifically of the work of the historian of religion, Charles Long, at the University of Chicago, who described and defined religion in his work as he tried to locate Black American religions alongside what he argued were more predominant white-facing religious studies paradigms. He argued religion should be seen not as a mere definition of belief, but as an orientation. And we see here then we are already located within the world, within a map, within a place, an orientation in an ultimate sense. That is how one comes to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place within the world. The religion of any people, he says, is more than a structure of thought. It's more than belief. It's experience, it's expression, it's motivation, it's intention, it's behavior, it is style, and it is rhythm. So, what might we do with Long's orientation for us? What happens if we begin to consider religion as part of a broader set of systems, perhaps as a cultural system? Located within various symbols? Might we engage in comparison, for example, across Islamic astronomy and Western astronomical star charts? Or might we engage in religious entrepreneurship within various cultural systems? This calls to mind the work of the scholar of religion Clifford Geertz, who defined religion primarily as a system of symbols, which he argued acts to establish pervasive and long-lasting moods and motivations in humans that will create for us, he says, a general order of existence. Now, Geertz's definition is difficult, and he recognizes with a great deal of humility in his work that there's no such thing as a complete definition of religion. It's quite impossible. However, what he tries to argue here is that religion, what happens if religion serves to us as a model of and for reality? If the systems of symbols that we mobilize, the material cultures, the words we use, the languages we speak, if the totality of this system might provide for us religion as a model for reality, a blueprint for the world and our place within it, a map for the world and our place within it, and a model of reality, a way in which we should be in the world. And so when he writes of religion as a model of and a model for reality, Geertz suggests to us that we should understand the concrete symbols that individuals and communities bring to work within the world. That the symbols people will draw upon, the languages, the words, the imagery, the material culture, tell us about our world, our place in it, and shape the world for us if we're engaged in religious or spiritual activity, or even, he'll write later, scientific activity. We get a certain set of habits, of dispositions, tendencies, capacities, propensities, skills, he says, as a result of our participation in this general order of existence or this world as model. This world as model may help us make sense of our suffering, for example. It might teach us how to endure suffering, how to endure failure, how to endure loss. And as I was preparing my remarks, I was just thinking that within the framework of religious entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship involves failure, or so I've been told. I am definitely not an entrepreneur, but it involves failure, or so I have heard from time to time. How would a religious entrepreneur, drawing upon this model of and for reality, these Geertzian systems of symbols, try to make sense of that failure? Or conversely, how might they try to make sense of that success? How do they use their general order of existence to comprehend the world, to give it precision, to feel it? How do they work through definitions of their emotions, of what they're experiencing as they're working through an entrepreneurial practice or project or business? How are they able to endure the stresses of that work? So Geertz says, from his definition, an anthropological approach. The anthropological study of religion, he says, unfolds for us in two stages. First, we should analyze the system of meanings embodied in the symbols of a given community's religion proper. Figure out what they use to assemble and create their model of and for reality. And second, we should relate these systems to psychological processes. And hopefully that you hear a resonance there, perhaps with some of your own work, because Geertz's model here would play very well, I think, with a number of sociological, anthropological, and psychological approaches to the study of religion generally, and religious entrepreneurship specifically. But there's an intervention that occurs in Geertz's definition from the 1970s, in the 1990s, in the work of the anthropologist of religion and Islamic studies scholar Talal Asad, who, in his essay, The Construction of Religion as an Anthropological Category, directly critiques Geertz as being, quote, ultimately mistaken. And it may be by the end of my talk, you will agree that I am ultimately mistaken. That is totally fine. Welcome to the study of religion. This is how it goes. But the worst thing any scholar, I think, might want to see in their work is someone else quoting them and saying, this is ultimately mistaken. I mean, it's a really precise, sharp, and it's a great phrase. But Assad's intervention is incredibly productive. He asks a series of questions, and you'll note a theme that emerges. If religious symbols, as Geertz describes them, he says, are understood as vehicles for meaning, can they be established independently of where they are used and the forms of life for which they are used? Second, if religious symbols, he says, are the work, the signs, the symbols of a sacred text, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, etc., can we know what they mean without regard to the broader social disciplines by which we understand how those texts are to be read? Is a text read in a vacuum? Or are the rules of reading that text, the languages of reading that text, its grammar, the meanings of its words read within a given context? Third, if the religious symbols someone draws upon to make sense of the world and their place in it are concepts by which our experiences, our behaviors, our ethics are to be organized, can we say anything about them without understanding how that individual or community sees them as authoritative or authentic? Finally, he says, if it's to be claimed that what is experienced through religious symbols is not, in essence, the social world, but just simply the spiritual world immanently in the world, is it possible to assert that conditions in the social world around us have nothing to do with making that kind of experience accessible? We hear across all of these interventions by Assad that we might need to begin thinking of Geertz's symbols, model of, model for, the ways someone makes sense of the world, their joy, their suffering through their religiosity. We might need to understand those symbols within a context and in relation to various forms of power. Assad concludes his essay, the argument here is not just that religious symbols are intimately linked to social life, and so will change with it, or that they usually support dominant political power, but they occasionally oppose it. It is that different kinds of practice, and maybe read here entrepreneurial practice, religious entrepreneurial practice, and different kinds of discourse, religious entrepreneurial discourse, are intrinsic to the field in which religious representations, like any representation, acquire their identity and their truthfulness. For those who hear the word field and think immediately of Habitus and Pierre Bourdieu, I'm right there with you. And I think Assad would be nodding along with you as well. What I'd like for us to do then, as I carry us forward into this orientation of religion as lived, is to provoke us to think about new contexts, new social fields, various forms of habitus, various forms of context within which we might attempt to envision and locate studies of religious entrepreneurship. So if religion then is orientation, as Long suggests, and religious experience, symbols, models must be grounded in the society around us, how then is religion lived? And this brings me to the work of the sociologist of religion, Nancy Ammerman, who has been branching out in a number of interdisciplinary ways. Ammerman suggests that this concept of lived religiosity is, quote, to expand our lens beyond official texts and doctrines, to think about how ideas about the sacred, thinking all the way back to Durkheim, emerge in official churches, synagogues, mosques, government offices, scholarship, but also unofficial places. It is to include the practices of ordinary peoples, not just religious leaders, not just those seen with certain forms of charismatic, bureaucratic, legal, or rational authority, for example, in a Weberian frame, but just ordinary, mundane peoples, not just religious leaders. It is to expect to find religion both in places coded as religious and in all those other everyday places that we may not think of as religious. It's to focus on what people are doing as well as what they are saying. Religious entrepreneurship, alongside Ammerman's definition, I would argue, is taking the concept of religion in that adjective and making it into a verb. We are, in a sense, pardon the grammar, religioning. We are doing religion out in the world. Lived religion, she suggests, is dynamic and creative. So in this framing, religious entrepreneurship as a field of inquiry shouldn't simply be adjectival. We shouldn't accept the received ideas of religion. After all, as Smith says, in doing so, we're just accepting prior scholars' attempts to establish data as religious data. Instead, we want to think about religious entrepreneurship as something that is done, performed, inhabited. We should provoke ourselves with some rather odd questions. What does religious entrepreneurship sound like? How does it taste? Every time I ask my students how religion tastes, they make this face. And we're in the Midwest, which is a largely majority Protestant and Catholic context here in the United States. And so they usually just go straight to the Eucharist or communion and talk about stale bread. But how does religious entrepreneurship taste? How does religious entrepreneurship smell? How do we imagine, or when we imagine religious entrepreneurship, what do we envision? What do we see? But when we see it, when we physically see it or sense it, what do we see? And how do those perceptions change for those who are differently or other-abled or of different identities, perhaps marginalized or minoritized identities in a given context? And then how does religious entrepreneurship feel, both in terms of tactile response, but and also in terms of emotional response? These are the interventions that Ammerman would like us to consider. I can't answer these questions. It's why I'm addressing a Zoom meeting full of experts that I hopefully can provoke to tell me what these things are. I simply cannot. I don't have the equipment for this to be able to do this. Ammerman suggests we might pursue these questions in various contexts. The most common of which, she says, as a sociologist of religion, what's most familiar to her is lived religion as institutional. Institutional lived religiosity, she suggests, is perhaps the most common in social scientific research of religion across multiple fields, disciplines, and avenues of inquiry, because institutions produce things for us that are countable. The Pew Research Foundation gives us data, right? We can study the number of parishioners at a given church or synagogue or mosque or temple. We might be able to measure participant rates. We might even be able to quantify measures of religious excitement or enthusiasm. We can weigh religion through data, how it influences actions beyond organizational boundaries. We might even be able to suggest that religion should occur or occurs in some places as opposed to others. This is a form of lived religiosity with which I would suggest many of us are probably familiar. But Ammerman also offers us the question of religion as established, religion and how it may influence, for example, local laws or taxes, how perhaps, for example, a religious entrepreneur comes to be seen as a model, an authority in a local community, both politically, socially, culturally, and in other ways. Established religious traditions, Ammerman suggests to us, are those where both an organized entity might claim jurisdiction over religious practice. Perhaps a church, a mosque, a synagogue upholds members of its congregation as exemplars in the local business community. But also an organized entity, for example, a state, recognizes those religious organizations as authentic, legitimate, legal, or permissible, meaning other groups may be excluded, those engaged in certain forms of religiosity, certain forms of business, or certain forms of religious entrepreneurship may be excluded from the established religious category. We also might see this, for example, in parallel in the work of Caroline Essers and Yvonne Binshop on Muslim businesswomen doing boundary work, their work on Muslim entrepreneurs, I believe if memory serves in the Netherlands, maybe in Denmark. I apologize if I got that wrong, to both authors. And compared to the work of Saba Mahmood, who is, as an anthropologist of religion, trying to understand the piety, the performed piety, the embodied piety of women in Cairo who manage to mobilize a certain form of spiritual capital that grants them certain modes of agency in a context that for many Western feminists would appear largely patriarchal, that would foreclose the possibilities of spiritual, moral, political, or economic activity. There's an interesting overlap in terms of how these two studies think about established religiosity within government, within society, within religious institutions and the family, and how those of identities that might appear to us marginalized in varying ways, those who identify as women or Muslim women in varying contexts, may be otherwise excluded from formal mechanisms of government control and power. Amberman also suggests that we consider lived religiosity as entangled. And this is where I hope I'm able to provoke a little bit of thinking, because entangled lived religiosities are the religiosities that we often take for granted in our day-to-day lives, the things that we don't think about. It's like when we don't really think about that we're breathing air right now and then suddenly do, and we breathe a little more quickly because we realize we're breathing air. These are things that occur, right, when we don't think of what is around us. These are religious practices so highly interwoven with everyday practical affairs, it's impossible to think of them as distinct forms of social life. And I think if we consider projects engaged in comparative study across religious entrepreneurships, those two comparisons put into conversation might lay bare to us certain entanglements we may not have otherwise considered, as they appear within life cycle events, rituals of business transactions, political or institutional organizing, our interactions and usages of the natural world, or perhaps even the unnatural or supernatural world, the architecture around us. Do religious entrepreneurs favor types of architecture, particularly if they're small business owners? Are they using architecture to signal certain forms of religiosity to those who are around them, for example? And then interstitial lived religiosity. Religion at the margins, religion as blend. What about religious entrepreneurs, for example, who may have been raised or grew up in interfaith or multi-faith households or multi-faith contexts? How do they negotiate their various religious or spiritual identities as entrepreneurs? How might they negotiate the entrepreneurial identity amid those 2, 3, 4 competing spiritual identities in the household or among their families? This is where religion comes to be lived in spaces in between, untethered from institutions. It may seem charismatic in a Weberian sense. It may challenge received wisdom. It may often involve flows of culture or natural life, organisms. As Thomas Tweed writes in his Crossing and Dwelling, a theory of religion, he calls religions confluences of organic cultural flows, intensifying our joy, confronting our suffering, and drawing on superhuman and human forces to make our home, our dwelling in the world, but also to move and to cross boundaries, social, political, economic, and others. We also might think of religion as embodied, how we might participate in the body as a body among other bodies. And Bourdieu's ideas, for example, come into play here. What we consume matters, what we produce matters, our emotions matter. How might we think about religious entrepreneurship as embodied, requiring certain forms of habitual embodied know-how? As my time draws to a close, I'd like to then have us be left with a reminder of J.Z. Smith's intervention. As scholars engaged in the study of religion, we are participating in the creation of data that will inform new and future definitions of religion. Your scholarship on religious entrepreneurship will make substantial contributions to our ever ongoing debates in the study of religion about just what human religiosity is and how it appears. Smith, in an essay, Map is Not Territory, where he notes that maps represent certain forms of data-driven decision-making, discusses religion as, quote, a quest within the bounds of the human condition for the power to manipulate and negotiate one's situation so as to have space in which to dwell. It's a power relative to our domains in such a way that we guarantee the conviction that our existence matters. Religion is a distinctive mode, then, of human creativity, he argues, a creativity which both discovers limits and creates limits for humane existence. What we study when we study religion, he says, is the variety of attempts to map, construct, and inhabit such positions of power through our usage of myths, rituals, and perhaps I would argue most importantly, our experiences of transformation, and I'd paraphrase, entrepreneurial and otherwise. I truly thank you, all of you, for being here today. I hope this was a provocative and productive intervention. I'm happy to share slides and answer questions as the day goes on, although in a few minutes I'm going to be running to class to teach some engineers about ethics. But thank you all for being here, and I hope this was a productive part and start to your day.
Nathan, thank you. Thank you so much for kicking us off. Thank you for raising the many directions, for encouraging deeper integration, for pushing us on not only religion matters, but also religious orientation, considering religious definitions, as well as how our study of religion actually influences the findings and the data that we're going to actually step into and understand. I'm super appreciative for all of your issues you've raised. Just in the interest, I know you've got to run, but one just quick question that sort of comes to mind is, help us to think about sort of ontologically then what that means as we begin to think about a lens by which we study religion and this notion of not just research, but also our influence on those findings. Any thoughts or any directions that you might help us think about what that then means as we step into this study?
Right. So I think the first place that I always begin, and it's part of sort of the way I was trained as a humanist in the study of religion, engaged in Islamic studies, is to always attend to insider and outsider positionality. Right. I am studying movements that the overwhelming vast majority of the world's Muslim communities reject as having anything to do with Islam. And so when I'm stepping into studying a movement that claims Islam for itself, I have to be very, very careful with how I discuss and analyze and present that movement in public, because my work in studying their interpretations of Islam to justify really horrific violence, I don't want that to shade over into the communities of Muslims whom I live and work alongside, right? I have a responsibility to attend to the statements of the movements whom I study, but I have a responsibility to the broader communities around me. So I think for me, it's always locating the questions, the scholarship, the findings that make me uncomfortable, and then paying attention to make sure that the communities whom I'm studying, what are they telling me about their boundaries? What is making them uncomfortable? How are they establishing normative practice and unorthodox or heterodox or unacceptable practice? If I can attend to both of those responsibly, then I can begin to have scholarship that advances a concept of religiosity that'll be empathetic in that it's familiar to those whom I study. Obviously, my commitments as a scholar are to my scholarship, right? There will always be points of disagreement and friction between the insider and outsider perspective. But I think it's the responsibility that we owe as scholars to the communities whom we are discussing and studying to make sure that when we are contributing their perspectives to the broader field, that we're attending to how their voices might be shaping and adding to, contributing to, and challenging our definitions and perceptions of religion, which are heavily, heavily culturally contextualized and linguistically contextualized.
No, fantastic. So once again, thank you so much for your time and for your push, for your provocation, for really kicking us off in just an incredible way to go much deeper on the study of religion. Thanks again, Nathan.
Thanks again for having me. Good luck,
Sure.
everyone. I hope it's productive.
Wherever you may be joining us from, morning, evening, middle of the day, we are delighted to have you here. Let me just provide a quick overview of the day, and then we'll go ahead and get rolling. So for the purpose of today, the real goal is to shine a spotlight on the fact that there is a growing movement at research at this intersection of faith and entrepreneurship. In a few moments, we'll continue our day with Jose Saraceda Lopez and David Townsend providing a brief overview of this field of research based on a review piece they're working on. We'll take a short break after their presentation, and then at 10:30, we're going to kick off into a showcase of one of the recent developments in the field. And this is the recently published special issue in Small Business Economics on religion and entrepreneurship. Here we will hear from the editors about their motivation for actually building this special issue, as well as short presentations from several of the articles that appear in that issue, so that you can either A, become more familiar, or B, have an opportunity to interact with some of the scholars as they have worked through a number of these issues. At 12 o'clock, we will, if you missed the SBA issue, you didn't submit, don't worry. We now have a future opportunity for you. And that's an upcoming issue in entrepreneurship and regional development. And we will hear from two of the special issue editors, Maruna Radu-Lefebvre and Alan Descrew Cruz, on that special issue and how that's sort of coming along. At 12:15, we will have a panel focused on the challenges and the opportunities of publishing in this space. Kylie Heels will lead a conversation with a number of senior scholars, including Peter Klein, Maruna, Ali Gumasay, Rob Pittick, and Stephanie Fernhaber, to talk about what are both the pitfalls, the challenges of publishing in this space, and what are the wonderful opportunities that become available. And then following that, we'll have a short break and move to an interactive session where scholars have actually sent in proposals, and we'll get feedback in different breakout rooms from different senior scholars. As part of that, if you've not submitted a proposal, that's fine. You are welcome to join any of those different breakout rooms and observe the conversation to, again, learn sort of vicariously through those conversations and kind of where those are going. In short, we have a full day ahead. There are just sort of no two ways around that. And as we step into that, I want to take a moment just to thank a lot of the people that made this day possible. First, I'd like to thank Corey Driver, our new director of the Center for Life, and all of his work. I'd like to thank Amanda Lawson, who has been with us for each and every one of the 4 L.I.F.E conferences, and she continues to put on an incredible event for us. I'd like to thank Tara Hoppy, our new associate director, who will be continuing to help move this work forward. I'd also like to thank Jeff Hainan, a name you guys may not know, but Jeff has been working with us over the last year to help us think strategically about where do we go around research, teaching, and practice of this work in faith and entrepreneurship. Jeff was formerly the founder of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. I'd also like to thank Tim Holcomb, our Institute Director of the Altman Center, Jenny Derrick, our Dean, and also a lot of the sponsors that make this work possible, not the least of the Williamson Family Foundation. In Q4 of last year, we were lucky enough, blessed enough to be able to close over $10 million in funding. And that allows us to now continue to carry on this work and continue to do it at very low cost to anyone, so that we can have everyone continue to participate. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you guys. Thanks to the participants for being here. Thank you for your active engagement. And this conference really doesn't happen if not for all of you. Lastly, I'd like to just sort of say for a moment that the conference is really just the next step. If we look sort of forward on kind of where we're going, following the conference, there are lots of things that come next. Once again, we will offer our PhD seminar on faith and entrepreneurship on August the 8th. It'll be the day before the Academy of Management. So if you want to share that out in your networks, any PhD students that you know, doctoral students, a number of the students that have been through that are publishing in this space and continue to work in this space. Secondly, we will be doing, for any of you who will be at the Social Entrepreneurship Research Conference next week in Lausanne, we will be there doing a paper development session for the upcoming special issue on entrepreneurship and regional development. Again, this special issue, manuscripts are not due until November the 1st. Here is a QR code that sort of links you back to that special issue. If you want any information on that special issue, you can find it all there. So that is kind of a quick overview of all the things that we have sort of going on for the day.